Now let's take a look at the performance of Amazon S3 buckets. So you might be using S3 in your architecture, for example, in your infrastructure, right, that you've designed for a number of different use cases. You might use S3 for static content. You might use S3 to perform a data link, for example, to store logs, right, to store images or ingested imports. Whatever the case is, if your requests to S3 is typically a mix of different things like get, put, delete, right, or list objects, operations, then how can you ensure that the consistent performance for that bucket is achieved? How do you avoid receiving slowdown exceptions being returned from the S3 APIs, for example? The answer to that is to add random hash to the actual object keys themselves. So you have to understand that S3 is a distributed system. No one server can handle all of the data that will be stored or all of the requests that you'll ask of it. So the data itself is actually distributed across a number of nodes. And that means that the data is partitioned. So the key name of your object will directly influence or dictate which partition that object is stored in. So if you take a look at an example here, right? So let's say you have a list of S3 object names or keys. So you'll notice that the pattern, is storing things by date, down to the day, for example. So what you have is, let's say, the number of objects you talk about or you're taking a look at, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions of records per day could be stored. So when you have, let's say, sequence of data itself, like alphabetical or, ordering of numbers, it will introduce a performance problem by forcing too much data into too few partitions. So you have a lot of data that can only be stored and served by fewer partitions. So ideally, you have that data spread across as many partitions as possible. And you can do that by leveraging random hashes as prefixes to those keys. So for example, you can add a random hash to the very beginning, right? In that case, you could potentially replace, right, maybe the entire key, for example, by random hash if you really wanted to. So again, that random hash will allow your data to be spread evenly across a number of partitions. So no one partition is responsible for any more data than any other partition if you compare them. So the thing to keep in mind is that while random hashes in S3 key names can improve performance, they remove the predictable prefix, right? And by removing that predictable prefix can make searching for objects a little more difficult. And we'll explore that in future lessons. So keep that in mind at this point, that S3 performance, how you name your objects, will directly influence your performance of that S3 bucket. And that's really important when you work with S3 buckets. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, post in the discussion area. We'll be happy to assist with this. Let's move to the next lesson.